All right, Spma 4P25, thank you very much for joining us today. It's going to give me great pleasure to introduce our next guest speaker. This is Dr. Dixon. He's from La Trobe University. And just to confirm, Dr. Dixon, is it okay if I record today's interview?
Most welcome to, Alex.
Perfect. That's fantastic. So this story is actually one that's been recently very impacted by COVID, and it's about the Australian Football League, the AFL, and their purchase of Marvel Stadium back in 2016. Now, what seems like miraculous strategic thinking and this almost godlike foresight to purchase this stadium, and because it's now managed to keep their entire league afloat. So to learn more, we have Dr. Dixon here to share some light on what's going on down under. Welcome, Dr. Dixon. Thank you very much. What was going on back in 2016? Why did they decide to make this purchase?
Thanks, Alex. It's good to be here. I wish everybody in Canada all the best in these difficult circumstances. The short answer is that the Australian Football League is the governing body for the sport of Australian football. And as part of that, they manage an elite competition, which today comprises about 18 teams distributed throughout Australia. And I think the story actually goes back to sometime in the mid-1980s, where most of the teams that play in the AFL are actually based in the city of Melbourne. So think of it as an 18-team competition. It's expanded in recent years from 12 to 18. But most of the teams are based in Melbourne. And historically, these teams all had their own home ground. And in the mid-1980s, the AFL of the day realised that these facilities were not very comfortable, especially to women and families. And they embarked on what they called a ground rationalisation process. And essentially meant that each team would no longer maintain their own home ground, but they would basically pool their resources and play out of two very high quality facilities. Back in the 1980s, this was the Melbourne Cricket Ground and what we called VFL Park. VFL Park was subsequently sold, and the AFL became part of this, what we now call Marvel Stadium. And to understand it, half of the Melbourne teams in the AFL play all of their home games out of the Melbourne Cricket Ground. The other half play all their home games out of what we now call Marvel Stadium. So by the time 2016, the AFL didn't really have control over the tenancy agreement that the clubs had with the owners of Marvel Stadium. And some clubs were on reasonably profitable type agreements, and others really struggled to make a profit out of it. So that was that's I guess the key context here is that, there are two big facilities in Melbourne, the Melbourne Cricket Ground, Marvel Stadium, and the AFL was keen to basically purchase Marvel Stadium to give it greater control, because as a governing body, one of the things that it's keen to do is to make sure that its affiliated organisations are good at what they do, that there's competitive balance, and the competitive balance sometimes starts with an even share of revenue and expenses and finances. So amongst all of that, the Marvel Stadium history is complicated. Built in around 2000, I went through a number of different ownership groups, and it was always earmarked to go to the AFL over, my recollection is, over about a 30-year period. But the AFL found a way to bring it forward. And so essentially they purchased Marvel Stadium, I think, for around $200 million. Yep. And they acquired ownership of that back in about in 2016. And so when that occurred in 2016, that was a big story in the newspapers. Everyone clapped. Everyone thought it was a good idea. And no one really thought too much of it until earlier this year.
Yeah, that's really when this decision kind of bore fruit. This is when the ability of a league to purchase a stadium resulted in them having tons of freedom. Can you tell us a little bit about the impacts of that post-COVID?
Yeah. So understanding, again, going back to why the AFL was motivated to own a facility, I think we have to use the word diversification somewhere in amongst it. That, the AFL as a governing body had, a certain number of revenue streams, that it could use to, the profits that could use to grow the game or manage the elite competition. Remember here that the AFL is a combination of the professional sports league as well as the national governing body. So it has an interest from grassroots sport all the way through to the commercial level. But essentially it diversified their revenue base. There's not much money to be made in owning a stadium if you also built the stadium, because stadiums are so expensive, you never actually get your money back. But if you're able to buy it a few years later at a discounted price, you can probably turn it into a profitable exercise, because the argument is that the AFL with its affiliated teams, they put on a great show, but then they've got to pay all this money out the door, so to speak, for a facility to play the games. But if they can essentially be seen to be paying themselves, then that rent, by a loose analogy, it's a little bit like the restaurant owner that also owns the building, the restaurant itself.
Yeah.
And any good restaurateur often aspires to that, because it keeps the money in the system, so to speak. The restaurant owner pays the landlord, and if that's the same person, happy days. So the short story is, you guys know the COVID story better than anyone. But when the COVID virus hit this year, the AFL played round one in, I think, late March or early April, and it was played in front of ghost stadiums.
Oh yeah.
And then basically the door got dropped, and the whole conversation here was, we need to keep the competition going because of the whole television rights. If we don't get the television rights, then the whole house of cards is going to collapse. We can perhaps get by without any crowds, but we've got to have somewhere to play. And that was the whole conversation there. But even have since been able to maintain the competition. We're about 3/4 of the way through it. It's a whole story in and of itself in terms of bubbles in different parts of Australia. But the short story is that the game was hemorrhaging financially at both the league, the governing body, and the 18 affiliated organisations. Membership sales, gate receipts, and were all at stake, and I forget how many hundreds of millions of dollars they were at risk of losing, but they were facing financial oblivion. The short story is, the AFL found itself with a $1 billion asset on its books. That was the estimated value of Marvel Stadium. And the AFL was able to negotiate a loan with one of its banking sponsors and a few other banks, where the short story is that they borrowed between $500 and $600 million against a $1 billion asset. So they obviously have to pay back that $500 million, which they will do over time. But the only reason that the banks were willing to lend this organisation that amount of money was that if the AFL's unable to pay it back, then the banks get ownership of a $1 billion asset. So the short story here is that as part of this vertical integration conversation, the AFL was able to end up with a $1 billion asset that it paid approximately $200 million for. Yeah. Looks like a real bargain. And then a couple of years later, it provided what I would call an asset base that they could borrow against, share that revenue with their affiliated teams, as well as pay their own bills. So in that sense, was this in the back of anyone's mind in 2016? I suspect not. Yeah. But if ever there's a story about, just in case and you never know what might happen, I think the moral of the story is that it's unlikely that having a $1 billion asset to your name is ever going to be a bad thing.
And so this is a very unique thing. This is kind of only the AFL that was able to secure an absolute asset in this form. That's not shared by many other leagues, is it?
No. To the best, I'll say to the best of my knowledge, I'm going to call it unique, but that's a word that you never really want to use. Certainly if I look at the other Australian professional sports leagues, National Rugby League in the sport of rugby league, the A-League in soccer, and our professional rugby union competition, which essentially covers South Africa, Australia, New Zealand. none of those governing bodies own an elite level facility. They're all essentially renters, as distinct from homeowners. So they don't have that sort of asset base. And at the time, the National Rugby League found their own formula to survive, but there was clearly recognition that their story is going to be different from the AFL because they don't have a $1 billion asset that they can borrow against.
Mm-hmm. Do you think that this decision that they made in 2016 is going to result in their league having advantages moving forward? Do you think that this is going to be a decision that will probably jettison them into a faster COVID recovery than many of the other leagues will face?
Yeah, I think it will, because arguably either the depth of the hole or the nature of the hole, and everyone's in a hole, but the depth of it, the nature of the hole, it gave the AFL options. What they would have done if they did not have that asset to lean upon, I think we'll wait for the CEO's biography to come out in a few years' time. But the short story is that by the AFL's decision to buy that stadium, history will judge them very favourably for doing so.
Good. And just one more question. So as they had the ability to vertically integrate when they purchased that stadium, they could kind of diversify their options as well in terms of having concerts or other various different events in there. And similar to what the NBA is kind of trying to do, which is actually moving away from ticket sales as a model for revenue generation and kind of using those new advertising opportunities and stuff like that. Do you see them perhaps making decisions like that, moving away from tickets as a base and more towards ad usage and other diverse factors for revenue generation?
Probably not in the same way. I see that their stadium ownership is a legitimate vertical integration. That they know that they create the AFL industry. They could see other people making a lot of money out of the AFL's core business, and they've essentially said, why don't we appropriate that for our causes? Whether it's up the food chain, down the food chain, it doesn't really matter. But if you're at the center of that universe and you see other people, your buyers and suppliers, making money out of you, there's always that temptation, well, why don't we find a way of getting that inside our tent as opposed to being in someone else's tent? It's a very, 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 very good decision. Diversification is something that all of our professional sports teams are talking about. And here was an instance where the governing body, as distinct from the affiliated teams, saw an opportunity to diversify its revenue stream and ultimately diversify its asset base.
Absolutely. Well, Dr. Dixon, thank you very much for all this incredible information that you've been able to give us and really clarify this quite interesting and multi-year story that's been unfolding. Is there anything else you'd like to share with the students?
No, again, I'll just finish where I started and wish everybody in Canada well, and invite everybody down to Australia one day, and we'll go watch the footy one night.
I would love to come down for some footy.
It's a date.
Thank you very much, Dr. Dixon. That was a pleasure speaking with you.
My pleasure.
Thank you.